Okay, so this is a really good lesson learned to make sure that your title slide reflects the project that you're talking about. This is actually this particular picture here is a rendering of a project that's in East Flatbush that we're not talking about today. This particular
Okay.
rendering is of Bethany Terraces. The Casa Pasiva project that we are talking about today is also in Brooklyn, but in the Bushwick neighborhood.
Right.
And what was the origin of the name Casa Pasiva?
So it's a passive house. We have
Okay.
so there is a large Hispanic and Latino population in Bushwick, and so we very cheekfully said, let's call it Casa Pasiva for that.
Great.
We're not great at naming our projects.
Trademark it.
Struggle. It's a huge struggle.
Okay, so I think to be respectful of your time, Emily, and everybody, I think we'll get started. Just for Steve and everybody else who's joined, welcome everybody. This is our monthly get together for a presentation and conversation and discussion of projects and issues facing affordable multifamily high performance in the Connecticut metro region. In this case, we're reaching across the river into Brooklyn. But actually, no, we're not. Yeah, we're reaching across the Sound into Brooklyn, I guess, and also Massachusetts and other places close by. And so this is a really fascinating project. And today we're going to be talking with Emily Kurtz, the, I guess, director of RiseBoro. Is that correct?
I'm Vice President of Housing.
Vice President of Housing for RiseBoro, which has done to date, I guess, with Emily's participation, over 2,000 units of housing, 1,800 units currently in construction, 3,700 units in the pipeline, with a focus on community engagement, affordable housing, and in this case, going for super high performance with a passive house standard retrofit of 9 buildings. As you said, confusing. Is it in is this one in Bushwick or it's in?
It's in Bushwick, yes.
In Bushwick, yeah, in Bushwick. Okay. And so Emily's going to talk, I think, a bit about the process of getting this project done, and the various aspects of it. Her expertise is in financing, developing, constructing, managing, operating and managing these facilities. So it comes at it from every perspective, which I think is going to be very interesting for all of us. So with that introduction, I'll just remind everybody, if you could mute yourselves, that would be good. While Emily is talking, if you have a question for her, she's more than willing to enter into discussion at any point, but out of sort of standard procedure, if you'll raise your hands, I'll recognize you. I'll interrupt Emily, recognize you, and you can ask your question. And then we'll open up the floor to discussion at the end. So with that, I'm really pleased. It's going to be a great presentation to turn this over to Emily Kurtz. Emily, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, Casa Pasiva.
Everyone, so what you're seeing is the PowerPoint, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you, Dean. Again, my name is Emily Kurtz. I'm the Vice President of Housing at RiseBoro Community Partnership, and I'm here today to talk to you about Casa Pasiva, which was our tenant-in-place deep energy retrofit. And we'll get into it. All right, so just a little bit about RiseBoro. We are a community-based organization. We have been in operation since the early 70s. And the housing division is one of 5 service divisions through which we provide services to Bushwick, Brooklyn, and throughout New York City. We started in Bushwick. We're based in Bushwick. I'm sitting in my office in Bushwick today, but we have started to expand. We actually started to expand during COVID into 4 out of the 5 boroughs. So we now have buildings throughout Brooklyn, a couple of buildings in Queens. We have a building in the Bronx and a couple of projects in Manhattan as well. And at RiseBoro, our mission is very simple. We unleash the potential of communities to thrive no matter the odds. in the housing division, as I mentioned, we are we are based in Bushwick, but we have started to expand. And my team here does, in addition to developing affordable housing and renovating affordable housing, we are also providing services, on-site services, and many of our buildings. We provide property management services, and we are also very involved in the design and construction of the projects in our pipeline and also in our portfolio. We have built our reputation on really pushing the envelope on sustainability and energy efficiency. This is a little bit of a brag slide. We started out in the very first NYSERDA. I know I'm speaking to a Connecticut group, but hopefully folks are familiar with NYSERDA. This is the New York State Energy Research and Design. What's the Dean? Do you know what the A stands for? Authority. So NYSERDA
Development Authority. Yeah.
Development Authority. So NYSERDA is the government entity that has really supported, I will say, the risks that RiseBoro has taken to push the envelope on sustainability, both in new construction and in preservation. And they've been a great partner, and we have spent, I would say, the last 15 years really developing this specialty in a sustainable and energy efficient design in affordable housing. I'd also say that because of our push to our very first passive house projects, which were designed and built in 2010, we really kind of, we really had to push everybody and drag everyone being the design, the local, to the New York State housing agencies and the city agencies and the city planning agencies to understand and accept what we were trying to do with our first few passive house new construction projects. And what we're really proud of is how much we have changed the industry and really moved the entire industry in affordable housing towards sustainable design, but also the New York City Building Code has changed in a significant way. I can't say we're fully responsible for it, but I do feel that we've played a part. So this is a quick overview of all of the passive house development that we've done at RiseBoro, starting with those two passive house projects I mentioned, Mennonite and Knickerbocker, and the different certifications that they've achieved, or in some cases will design to the passive house standard and not go for certification, and in other cases will go fully through to certification. Okay, so Casa Pasiva. Casa Pasiva is a 9-building, so 9 separate doors, 146 unit project that we started probably in design in 2016. Four of the buildings are contiguous on one block, but with four separate doors, front doors. So that they're called the Grove Street cluster. These are the Grove buildings. There are 3 buildings situated on one block. 2 are next to each other and 1 is across the street. And 2 of the buildings are what we'll call scattered. They're not close to either the 3-building site or the 4-building contiguous site, but they're all within a mile of each other in Bushwick. These projects are 100% affordable. 7 of the buildings were already had regulatory agreements, meaning that this was actually a preservation project to continue the the affordability of these projects, and they had been built at a time before there was an emphasis on reserves that could be used for building upgrades. So they were in there was a lot of deferred maintenance that needed to be addressed in the buildings. That's for these two buildings, 104 and 110 Grove Street. The Harmon buildings, which were the three on the street together, they were actually new construction, one of RiseBoro's very first tax credit projects. And so for these buildings, it was a recapitalization and a reinvestment in the buildings. And then two of the buildings were HDFC co-ops, which means that failing HDFC co-ops. So the tenants, they were tenant owned co-ops, which is it's a complicated structure. I'm not going to get into it too much. But the short of it is that they had not raised rents in many, many years. There was extraordinary deferred maintenance, and there was also tax liens on the buildings. So we took all of these disparate projects, disparate ownerships, and combined them under one ownership called Casa Pasiva. So the scope of Casa Pasiva, the driving force was this deep energy retrofit, but we also did tenant improvements in individual apartments. The Dean mentioned, I'm not going to get too much into the technical detail here, but in effect, the way that the architect, who's Chris Benedict, the way that the architect approached the design of this building was to turn it inside out. So taking the ventilation ductwork for the HVAC systems and running it on the outside of the building, and then wrapping all that ductwork in a new facade. So hopefully you can see that here. This is the original facade of one of the buildings, and here this picture shows that same building iced like a cake, basically. I think that's how Chris Benedict talks about it. Just complete new facade all around the exterior of the building, with the ductwork running up the exterior. And in this picture, you can see the rooftop ERVs through which the new ventilation system is running. We also replaced all the windows. And then within the tenant apartments, we did kitchen upgrades, we replaced the floors, we repainted. And then in common areas, we touched up the vestibules with new front doors, repainted all hallways. As many of these buildings actually have interior windows along the hallways. We replaced all of those windows. And then financing. So this was actually pretty straightforward financing as affordable housing projects go. We received Retrofit New York subsidy of $1.8 million. In general, 9 buildings, 146 units. It was not a very expensive project, all things being equal. The acquisition, we were able to get tax credits on the acquisition of the projects, which helped with the financing. So we had Retrofit New York, we had tax exempt bond finance from New York State Housing Finance, HFA, and those tax exempt bonds came with 4% low-income housing tax credits, which we then were able to turn into equity to help finance a project. And we also had a significant amount of city and state subsidy in the project. But again, this was compared to new construction projects, this was actually an efficient not just in design, but also in the use of city and state subsidy. So I think what I would really love to talk about are the lessons learned here. I think for me, it's the easiest way to digest how this project came together, decisions we made, decisions we might not make in the future. But before I get into that, are there any questions about the slides that I've already gone through?
I don't see any. If you have questions, go ahead and ask them. Make sure to unmute yourselves and or raise your hand. I'll recognize you, and then you can unmute yourself. I'm not seeing
Hey there,
anything. Oh, Patrick. Yep.
Hey, yeah, my name is Patrick McKenna. Thanks for sharing information about the project. I have a couple of questions about the envelope upgrades that you made. And a few questions. One, I assume these were not listed as historic buildings and you didn't have any issue. It looks like it was stone and brick. Is that right?
That's correct.
Previously. And so, what was the discussion or concerns about covering up that what looks like a pretty elegant facade? And then kind of related to that, how, you said you put ventilation on the outside and then so how far out did that facade extend, and were there any issues with right-of-ways, and encroaching on sidewalks?
Sure, yeah, and I will answer that to the extent that I can. So the first question about covering up the facade, it's a great question. In fact, this project was intended to have 3 more buildings in it when we started the planning in 2016. Those 3 buildings were each also tax credit, former tax credit projects, and we were not able to exit our partnerships with the limited partner. That's probably an entire other conversation, but we actually had to sue Sun America and to eventually have them exit and provide us our right of first refusal as a not-for-profit. Again, the Casa could easily be called the Saga project as well. There are many, many things that happened on this particular project. But in any case, one of those buildings, one of those 3 that weren't included, does have like a really interesting, I want to call it Bavarian facade. We had a lot of conversations about what it would mean. It's not historic, but it is iconic for the neighborhood, and what would it mean to cover up that type of facade with something that's more modern, because I think these are quite modern. The facades here, they look wonderful, but they're not typical what you would see here in Bushwick. And so with that building, what we started to explore was the treatment of the stucco. You can do a lot with stucco. There are ways to imprint it to look like brick. So that was going to be our approach, and maybe our approach, because we do still plan to do the upgrades to that building, but probably with a more in a way that would make it look more like the building looks right now, rather than putting on a brand new a new facade that echoes a little bit of what it used to look like, but is completely different. And hopefully that answers that question. And then your second question was, remind me what the second. Oh, the
extent that you projected out.
Yeah. So in New York City, there was a change in the code that I think it allows for 8 inches outside of the building envelope if it's for facade, or if it's for insulation. So, and actually the architect Chris was influential in getting that written into the code. So that is how we were able to apply a new facade on top of an existing facade and not go outside of, have those types of issues.
And let me interrupt. We've got a couple more. I think Alvaro and maybe Kathy both have questions. For those of you who came in a little late, the preface to this presentation was it's mostly about the development process and how these buildings actually got actually constructed and operational, as opposed to some of the design details and the technical information that we've had in other presentations. There's not going to be that much here. Emily will go as far as she can, but in terms of questions about how the actual ventilation system worked on the outside, I'm assuming, Emily, you would defer that
I
to
would prefer
somebody else
not.
in the future, huh?
Yes, I would prefer not to have to trip over that answer, yes.
But I think it's I mean, the background, I believe it's an interesting decision to make to utilize the facade in this way. And then, as far as I can tell from these images, the enlivening elements on the facade are the ventilation systems. And so that's typologically, that's an interesting thing to think about as designers and developers, but actually the techniques of how it works, particularly how it works to the passive house standard, I think, unfortunately for this talk, it's not going to be, but maybe we'll get another one about it that delves into the details more. So that's just a way of Alvaro, and I'm pronouncing that right, I'm hoping, and Kathy, in your questions. So I think, Alvaro, you were first. I muted you. I'll unmute you right now. Or maybe you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. Thank you so much. I was a little more concerned about if you were able to develop a full net zero inside the envelope. And by asking that, I know you replace the windows, and more likely the dual pane windows by themselves don't do the job. I mean, there is additional retrofit needed on the frames of the windows and the doors and all of that in order to get to net zero. So that was my only concern. I didn't hear anything about that part, but maybe I missed it at the beginning.
They're not net zero buildings. We were not aiming for net zero on this project.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks,
I'll
Alvaro.
also just mention really quickly, one of the things that we're pretty proud of here is that we nearly electrified these projects. The domestic hot water is still gas powered, but everything else is we were able to electrify, including tenant stoves, which we'll talk about as one of the lessons learned. But that was another goal of ours to in this particular retrofit.
Great. Kathy, did you have a question? Kathy Dorgan? I see you're not muted, so. All right, it looks.
Hi, I'm sorry, my service is kind of bad, but I was really interested in the conversation about the lobbying you did for the code changes, and if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that was actually our architect. We were not, she started that work well before designing this particular project, but from what I understand, there, in order to be able to get the level of insulation needed, she was running into code issues where she couldn't she went, how can I say this, where she wasn't able to go outside of the buildable square footage of the envelope of the building. And so she helps the city rewrite the codes that would allow for this intrusion, but only for insulation. That's like a very high level explanation. It happened a while ago.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and people should know who aren't familiar with Chris Benedict. She's been pushing the envelope, quote. Unfortunately, I had to say that, but in this case, accurately, on these on high performance for decades now. And so, if you can check out some of her work as well, maybe we'll get her on at some point in the future. I don't see any other raised hands, but Sharon, you're not muted. Did you want to say something, Sharon Wirt?
I'd love to say something, but I'd lost connection thanks to the very dicey network we have here in Southbury. So I missed quite a bit. I will try to catch up with you in the recorded version.
Okay.
I don't have any questions at the moment. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Sharon. Okay, Emily, I think with that, maybe you can move forward to the next section
Sure.
in terms of the lessons.
Yeah. So I think also I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about why we did this. I realize I kind of like jumped right into the what, but I want to talk a little bit about the why. So as I mentioned, these were 9 separate buildings. They were at various levels of need, and were also various levels of regulation in terms of affordability. As a nonprofit community-based developer, we are committed to long-term affordability. We are a long-term owner of assets, and we're looking for innovative ways we're also committed to reducing the carbon footprint of our portfolio. And so we were looking for innovative ways to both bring in capital to the buildings to make improvements while also achieving deep energy retrofit goals. And so we started this idea back in, I think 2016, where like, well, we've had so much success in developing our first 2 new construction passive house projects. Like, what if we were to apply the same standard to existing buildings? We have these buildings that we need to figure out how to finance. Let's try and let's try and do it all. Is basically, we're like, we're very we were very confident that and also willing to kind of try it. So I think that also has a lot to do with the spirit of how we approach hard problems at RiseBoro, because we work in what could seem like impossible situations and try and do what we can to alleviate the roadblocks. So that was the origin story. We had these buildings. Again, there were 3 additional buildings that we were hoped to include, but we couldn't because of our because basically we couldn't get an agreement from our limited partner. And we worked with Chris. She designed our first 2 projects as well, our first 2 passive house projects. And we kind of really looked at it as a pilot. Like, we wanted to see each of the buildings is slightly different. They're all walk-ups, but they each had slightly different typologies. They were built at different times. And we saw it as a pilot through which we could create multiple approaches to retrofitting existing buildings. So it was super exciting. I think we underestimated the actual level of effort it would take. Number one, just in legally being able to do what we wanted to with the buildings, which again is why three buildings were not included. That was the first hurdle. We knew how challenging tenant in place rehab is, like, because we're a community-based organization. We have wonderful relationships with our tenants, and even still, it was really, really hard. And I think, like, looking back, we would make different choices, which I can talk about. Alvaro, I'm wondering when I'm going to get my lunch. Is that coming to me next? No, he doesn't. That's fine. So yes, in tenant engagement, I think there are a lot of lessons we learned there. The financing of this, and that was maybe the easiest part, actually, because there was such a high interest in investing in projects that would serve as models for for the entire industry on how we could do this. But it's still complicated because it's an affordable housing project, and affordable housing financing is complicated. But again, we had to renovate these buildings because they were in need of capital improvements. We have to figure out, as an industry, how we're going to address the carbon footprint of our built environment. And so, we had to maintain the affordability of the projects for the long term. So that's kind of why we did it. We closed on the financing of this project in 2019, the August 2019, and construction started in earnest like November. And then so this is 6 months before COVID. I remember where I was the night that the NBA shut down. I was actually at a tenant meeting in one of the Casa Pasiva buildings, and that, I think, unfortunately, that timing had really had a massive impact on this project. It impacted our relationships with our tenants. It impacted the construction timing. It impacted our GC in many ways, and also that, in addition to how COVID impacted all of our lives. But it is a major aspect of the complications that arose while we were in construction. So tenant engagement, some of the lessons that we learned. I think, again, we were meeting with tenants. We met with them multiple times. When you use financing through the city in a rehab project, there is a process called rent restructuring that is utilized to reset rents. No tenant pays more than 30% of their income in rent, and that's the affordability standard. But in projects where tenants have been living for 15 or 20 years, even having your rent increase to 30% of your income can mean a $300, $400 increase in rent. And that, I think, just starting, that was their main concern. Their number one concern is what's going to happen to our rent. And we had a really hard time getting past that conversation. We had a requirement by the city of rent restructuring. We had tenants who we relied on to cooperate with us, and in between that was this question of what's going to happen to our rent. And so that was a really hard conversation. And I think a lesson we learned is that when doing tenant in place rehab, there should be a focus, or there should be a prioritization of not raising rents at all costs. I think it'll just help. In our experience, it would have helped mightily with our conversations with the tenants. We made some changes to the tenants' homes, and many of those changes were positive, but they were, I don't know that, I think we could have done a better job explaining those changes. We were very focused on the positive. We had meetings. As I was preparing for this, I saw all of the presentations that we put together to explain the induction stoves, to explain the new HVAC systems, and yet we still did not crack we still were not able to really get full buy-in from all of our tenants. So another aspect of this project, of things that happened during this construction, is that we actually had to kick off the initial GC. We had to call their bond and bring in a second GC for the second phase. That was hard, but was also an opportunity to make some changes between the phases. So in the first phase, we tried to do this without moving the tenants completely out of their building, out of their units, because we thought it would be less disruptive. So we had hospitality suites where tenants could go during the day and then they could go back to their units at night. But we were replacing kitchens and we were replacing floors and we were replacing, like, it was not light touch. Like, we were in there doing some serious improvements. And because the GC was struggling on that first phase, they were not meeting their deadlines. Because it was COVID, we could only have 1 or 2 people in the units at a time. Basically, what we learned is we should have moved the tenants out. We should have packed up their stuff, moved them out for 2 weeks to a hotel, and then moved them back. And it would have been better for them. It would have been more efficient in the unit. And so that's what we did for phase 2. So I think another lesson that we learned is that it's just tenant in place. Like, you need to overestimate the impact that it'll have on the tenants living in the units in terms of whether or not they should stay or they should leave. So that was another lesson that we learned. We also learned about phasing. So when we started these projects in phase 1, we thought we should do like kind of we went for the systems. We did the systems first. So we did all of the HVAC work, the facade work, the roof replacement before we did anything inside the tenants' units or in the lobbies. And so the tenants were inconvenienced because their buildings were under construction, but they weren't seeing any of the improvements until the end. And so we flipped that on phase 2, and we did common area improvements that the tenants could see immediately before doing some of the other critical, but maybe less important to the tenants, if that makes sense. So that's another lesson that we learned was around construction phasing. For future projects, we will be increasing the number of property managers or maintenance staff on any project that has tenants in place. It is just really hard to maintain a building while it's a construction site. It is very hard to meet the needs of tenants who are living in a construction site. So again, lessons learned between phase 1 and phase 2. In phase 2, we had a dedicated project manager who kind of integrated with property management. We still have kinks to work out in the communication between the property management team and the project management team. That is always a complicated relationship. But I think if we were to do it again, I might pay the property management team to hire additional staff so that it's more integrated with property management. So that's during construction. Post-construction, these are brand new systems, and we did lots of education and demonstrations. But I don't think, even though we anticipated the learning curve, we didn't fully anticipate the learning curve. There are also new systems in the tenants' apartments. So just last night, we actually had a tenant meeting. We had a meeting with the tenant association of Casa Pasiva, and they brought in the vents in the kitchen and in the splits, the air filters in the splits, and said, Emily, these are 7.5 feet up the wall, like, and you expect tenants to clean these, like, how that if you have elderly people living in these units, how do these things get cleaned? Before, when they had wall units or window units, cleaning the filters were easy because you just popped off the front and you clean the filter. But here it's a system. They're scared breaking it or whatever it is. And these are all things that at least I didn't think about and need to be thought about. So are you going to make that a property management requirement, or are the supers going to do this, or should you hire an outside consultant, or not consultant, contractor who can come in once or twice a year and service all the units? So those are all things that have come up that we've learned that we maybe hadn't anticipated. We talked about rent restructuring already, and then gas to electric. So it seems to be an issue for some people, not for other people, but it definitely needs to be talked about that tenants may not want their stoves, their cooking, their stoves changed from cooking gas to electric. We anticipated that and upgraded to induction stoves, but it did not fully, that people were not fully on board, I will say. I think I don't know the answer to this question, but I think it would be good to understand the impact of doing a gas stove to electric stove. Like what impact does that have on tenant health? What impact does that have on the carbon footprint? I don't know those answers, but I think it's important to look at each of the components and determine what is the overall gain from making that particular decision. So that, I think, are many of the lessons that we have learned on this project, and I'd be happy to open it up for questions.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, great, a great project. And one of the things I jotted down early in my notes was that, as an owner, developer, operator, manager, how do you systematically catalog knowledge that you're gaining from project to project? And you sort of went through that, at least here with the two phases. So it's an advantage that I think an organization like yours may have over some one and done types of projects, where you learn by consistently upgrading the lessons that you're learning from project to project. I also, just on this last issue of gas to electric, it just occurred to me while you were talking, there may be some issues of health and some other things, but there may be just in tenant terms, what you're used to.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's a lot of people, it's fire, and it's just fire, and that's the way it is. And so, it's not going from gas to electric, it's going to induction, but you are changing. You're not going from electric to induction.
Right.
You're going from gas to induction because it's better for the planet. I mean, I get that as a pushback from tenants. So, but I know Kathy is having some trouble with her service, but she, maybe she's all set now. Kathy, do you want to ask your question? Are you?
No, that was the question I asked earlier.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So I wanted to ask a question because she was talking about policy. In terms of the exterior insulation and working from the outside, so that's an advantage in terms of disruption. It sounds like in your case, when you flip them, it worked better. Disrupt after we fix the inside rather than disrupt before we get to see the final version of it. But in terms of that that increasing, lowering the disruption, allowing tenant in place retrofits, that seems to me to be a very potentially powerful argument in the code discussions that one could have. It's already been taking place in New York, but in other jurisdictions, it's an argument, not just necessarily for high performance and passive and energy efficiency, but for tenant disruption, and could flip the capacity for a tenant in place retrofit to take place. I don't know if you've thought about that or if that emerged but it seemed to me that might be an argument you could make for doing that and having the code allow it.
The insulation on the outside, like moving all of the systems to the outside and yeah,
and increasing, yeah.
Yeah, I do think it I agree. I don't think without being able to do that exterior approach, we would have been able to hit the passive house standard, and it would have been incredibly way more disruptive to tenants. We were able to replace the windows from the outside, for example. Like there were really innovative things that we did to decrease the impact on the tenants that they probably don't even realize.
Yeah.
But even still, like we knew with phase two to, just like make the lobbies, like we paint the lobbies first. Even if we have to go back and touch up afterwards, paint the lobbies first so that they see something immediately. So tenants see something immediately, that their experience in the building is immediately improved. And if you have to go back and do it, like do a little bit again, okay. That's actually the reason why we didn't do the lobbies in phase one, is because we were worried about them getting scratched up
damage,
as we were moving. But it's touch up, right? Like, so what? And I'm gonna say lesson learned like a gazillion times, because this entire project was just lesson after lesson after lesson learned.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And the bigger learning curve that you were talking about with the tenants, that also makes sense. Did you had 4 buildings, I guess, that touched, and a couple that didn't, a couple were scatter site, or infill, and you ended up in an ownership structure where you owned all of them. Is that correct? Did you develop all of them at the same time? Did you phase one building, then the next, then the next? Did you work building? How did that work?
So the financing for the project all happened at one time, and then we phased it for construction purposes, which I'm really glad that we did, because we only had to kick a GC off of 4 buildings instead of kicking them off of 9 buildings. But all the financing happened at the same time. However, when we pulled the bond on the GC, we had to completely re-underwrite the project because of the delays, and the second GC that we brought in came in at higher numbers. And so we did actually, this was considered, we had to go back to the state for additional funds, which they gave us, which is great, but it was it was scary, because I think we under-financed this project in the beginning. Like, I think we did it incredibly efficiently. Like, as I said, I think, looking back, we should have had more. We should have had a bigger construction budget, and maybe what we should have done is had a larger contingency, just because like tenant in place rehab is riskier. That's another lesson learned, is that you can't finance the contingency on these projects in the same way that you would with a new construction deal. And soft costs, like our soft costs, for phase 2, when we started putting tenants into hotels, that was a huge expense that increased our soft cost budget. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, yes, yeah, it did. I'm multitasking. I'm looking at the chat to see what other people have to ask you about. Okay, so one question, and feel free to ask these if you want to, Dea and Steve, but I can ask
I
them
can
for
ask the question.
Yeah.
I just wasn't sure if I missed something because I came late. But do you see tenants saving money on energy bills from electrification, or does the benefit mainly go to the landlords of the units? And like, how do you deal with that situation and to incentivize tenants to want to be a part of these projects?
yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to trip over all of this, but a couple of things. One, we are sub-metering. Another lesson learned, we have stopped sub-metering because it is such a complicated process. We haven't stopped on this building, meaning in future buildings. We're figuring out a different way to do it. So, and we will be installing solar here, but we haven't yet. So in terms of impact on the tenants, in the buildings, also complicated. Half the buildings tenants paid for their gas, for their gas stoves, and half the buildings the tenants did not pay for their gas stoves. So it's actually a different, it's a difference in the services. It impacts their rent. So the first thing that happened is, I will eventually answer your question, but the first thing that happened is when we transitioned from the gas stoves to the electric stoves, we were giving everybody in the buildings where we had paid for the gas. Now that electric stove is on the tenant's meter. And so we gave the tenants a refund that was equivalent to the utility allowance for a gas stove. So that's not answering the question whether or not the tenants are seeing a reduction in their energy bill, but more that it's not just as easy as going from gas to electric. There are so many things that are associated with that impact the tenant on their their monthly costs, that as developer, as owner of affordable housing, we are responsible to figure out. And then in terms of the energy bills, we are tracking that. I don't have the exact numbers, but the intent is that by transitioning these buildings to the Passive House standard and installing the mini split systems, tenants continue to only pay for cooling. We pay for the heating. That the use of the AC should be reduced because it's a tighter unit. I don't know how other things are impacting that, though. For example, the cost of electric, which we will be able to control once we have solar up on the roof, and the change in the basically warming of our city. When are we going to see that we're going to start turning on the AC for tenants, earlier and earlier, or that extends later and later into the fall, just based on the warming of the planet? That could, just logically become more expensive for the tenants. So I can get better numbers. We do track it. I just didn't think to pull it for this, and I can follow up with tenant energy spend. Overall, we believe the tenant energy spend has gone down.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I was thinking about like how you incentivize landlords to become a part of these projects. I think I have a lot more questions, but I also have to leave for another meeting in 3 minutes. So we could follow up, but this was a really great answer to the question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dean can share my contact information. Please feel free to reach out.
Great. Okay, yeah, we are getting close to the time bell. Steve, I thought you had a comment. Does anybody else want to ask a question while we have Emily? And her time, I think
I just put it in chat. I just toured a very large affordable housing project in Bridgewater, and they installed induction stoves when they built the project a number of years ago, but they weren't faced with the issue of taking away somebody's gas stove. That's a big difference.
Yeah. It's either the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds, but
yeah, right.
So.
Yeah, I wonder what we'll start to think about is like, is that a choice we want to give to the tenants? Do we want to say like, and the reason I don't know the answer to this because I actually don't know what the impact is of that specific change on the overall sustainability numbers. But I think giving tenants some level of choice and deciding where tenants can have choice is another lesson we learned between the first and second, actually between this project and another project. So we gave tenants, we're doing a hybrid tenant in place passive rehab project currently, and we actually provided designs, like the bathroom tile design. We gave tenants choice, the tenants that are returning, like what tile design do you prefer? And I think that helped a lot in the communication with those tenants. So yeah, I don't know enough to know if we can put that up for a vote, gas or electric. But if that's one of the areas that you could, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think that's an intriguing tactic also, I think, to do in terms of engaging tenants around things that empower them, but don't necessarily, their choices don't necessarily have the potential to impact the feasibility of the financing, that kind of thing, in terms of how you've modeled the building. Yeah, that's an interesting one. So, yeah, keep lesson learned. Patrick, do you have another comment?
I do, yeah, just in regards to the stoves, you know, we're working with Connecticut Children's Medical Center on some of our existing buildings. And we have gas stoves without kitchen exhaust in some existing kitchens. And the choice from a health option was to either install exhaust or switch it out to electric. You know, and our choice there, you know, for a number of reasons. One, for safety reasons, getting kind of combustion out of an apartment. And also for health reasons, you know, getting emissions out of apartment. You know, we're choosing to switch those stoves over to electric. You know, there is significant research being done on the health impact of, you know, gas use, burning gas in a residence, and they, you know, and it significantly adds to asthma and other conditions. So, you know, apart from, you know, the environmental and sustainability side of things, there's kind of advantages to switching these out from a health and safety as well.
100%, and that's actually that also drove our decision to make that change from gas to electric, is the health benefits that accompany that change. And yeah, I totally agree. But does the stress of going from gas to electric, like for a family that is culturally connected to how their food is cooked, like what is the trade-off? I think those were the trade-offs that we weren't thinking about. We also were like, oh well, you know, the asthma rates in Bushwick are high, and if we can eliminate or improve the air quality within the unit, and we know that the impact of gas burning in the unit is you know, really has a terrible effect on air quality, well then it's a no-brainer. But what we didn't think about is the family that is, you know, again, connected in some way to how they cook their food. I'm not saying it outweighs it or it doesn't outweigh it. I'm just saying we didn't really think about it, and I think it's something that has to be thought about, and that the qualitative impact is as important as like the quantitative impact, and I just think we need to think about it more.
Yeah, oh, it's a great idea. And then how do you do those trade-offs that maybe make up for that, those kinds of decisions? Yeah.
Right.
Well, on that note, unless there's other questions from our group, anybody else? Last chance. Going once, twice, three times. Okay. All right. Well, then, please, everybody, join me in thanking Emily Kurtz. Great presentation, great, interesting project, and it looks like there's more on the way. So, hopefully, a conversation to be continued. Yeah, thank you very much. Everybody can applaud.
Yes,
like
thanks,
I'm doing
Emily.
now.
Thank you so much. That was
Yeah.
great.
Thank you for having
Really
me.
terrific.
Have a
All
nice
right.
day.
Thanks for being with us.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have good weekends. We'll reconvene again in a month and continue this process of exploring how to improve the performance of affordable multifamily housing.
Thank
Have
you.
good weekends.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, bye.